Hello. We're starting. We don't want to miss a second of this. It's my great joy to welcome you to the Loft Hour, which is hosted by the Arts Research Center here at Berkeley on the ancestral homelands and the unceded territory of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. My name is Lauren Croys, and I'm an associate professor in the History of Art department. And I'll be your moderator today for this event with Andy, who complains that his face is too big here, Andy Shanken, and Stephanie Syjuco, which is my great joy. And I'm also delighted that I didn't do anything to organize this event. So for that, we have to thank the Arts Research Center, particularly the director, Beth Piatot, and associate director, Larry McPhee. And in addition to the Arts Research Center, I want to thank the Dean's Office of the Division of Arts and Humanities and our colleagues at Berkeley AV. I'm also grateful to all of you for showing up to spend your lunch chatting and learning inside, which often seems impossible after spring break at Berkeley. So I'll say my own work focuses mostly on art made in or in relationship to the United States during the 20th century, and I'm particularly interested in how we define modernism and citizenship, particularly as it's inflected by race, gender, and class differences. So thinking about those things on this campus for what always surprises me more than a decade now, I've had the great pleasure of working and thinking and being inspired by both Andy and Stephanie. I usually wait at least a few days when anyone around here asks me to do anything, but when Beth asked me if I wanted to moderate this Loft Hour, I said, yes, immediately. I emailed her back. So today I'm going to give short intros for Stephanie and Andy, and then they'll each talk for about 10 minutes. Then I'll ask a couple questions, and then I'll open it up to you all for your questions. So we've changed the order, and I'm just gonna move my thing around. Okay. Stephanie Syjuco works in photography, sculpture, and installation, moving from handmade and craft-made mediums to digital editing and archive excavations. Recently, she's focused on how photography and image-based processes are implicated in the construction of racialized, exclusionary narratives of American history and citizenship. Born in the Philippines, Stephanie has been a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship Award, a Joan Mitchell Painters and Sculptors Award, and a Tiffany Foundation Award, among many other honors. Her work is in numerous collections, including in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Metropolitan Museum, the Getty Museum, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, among many others. She has been a visiting artist in a million places, including as a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow at the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., and she was also featured in the acclaimed PBS documentary series Art 21, Art in the 21st Century. And Stephanie is an associate professor in sculpture in the Department of Art Practice here. Moving on to Andy. Andy Shanken is an architectural and urban historian with an interest in how cultural constructions of memory shape the built environment and vice versa. He also works on unbuilt and paper architecture, themed landscapes, heritage and conservation planning, consumer culture and architecture, among a bunch of other things. Andy's interested in historiography, particularly of architectural history, and the intersection of popular culture and architecture. Andy's first book, 1940X, I've never asked you how you say that, whatever, 194X, examines how American architects and planners on the American home front anticipated the world after World War II. And his second book, Into the Void Pacific, looks at the architecture of the neglected 1939 San Francisco World's Fair. His third book, The Everyday Life of Memorials, came out recently from Zone Books, and it brings architectural history into conversation with memory studies and studies of the everyday. Andy's a professor in the Department of Architecture and American Studies, and he's also faculty curator of the Environmental Design Archives and currently director of American Studies here. So I could go on much longer, but now I'll turn it over to Stephanie and Andy to tell you about their work instead. So they'll each have about 10 minutes. Stephanie.
Okay, wow, what an honor to be here and in this company, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. So keeping it to 10 minutes is going to be tough, but we will do this. All right. So again, thank you for having me. I'm really excited about this. I'm trying to condense a lot of big ideas, but so bear with me because I usually am given an hour to talk, so 10 minutes is a fun challenge. So I'm calling it Rogue States and Unruly Archives. My work recycles, copies, resuscitates, warps, reframes, rips off, plunders, and hinges on existing forms and historical archives because the past is still unfinished business. Some of the creative tactics that I employ, and I'm sharing these as a list just because I know we have so many art students here. These tactics include obfuscating, layering or piling, fragmenting, damaging, crumpling, folding, selective cropping, editing, framing, pixelating, downsampling, blurring, removing, healing, inverting, reversing, presenting in as-is condition, rephotographing, republishing, reprinting, revealing, releasing, and even re-archiving. So in order to get to this kind of work, though, I've been a practicing artist for about 30 years now. Prior to the last 6 years in which I've really focused on archives, my work was large scale and it involved collaborations with different institutions to produce installations that sometimes had hundreds or even thousands of objects that were kind of displayed or even produced on site. I also call myself my center is actually as someone who makes sculpture, but as a contemporary artist, that radiates into so many fields now. So I like to show this just because when people think about what an artist does, they have a tendency to kind of put things into very specific disciplines. Versus, I think, the beauty of being a contemporary artist today is this kind of vast array of possibilities. But what I'm going to focus on today is pretty much recent work from formal archives, because as I mentioned in one of the first slides, the past is unfinished business. And if archives are a kind of place that's supposed to be a repository of both institutional or community knowledge, what can we unearth in those spaces to essentially talk about what's still happening today? So I've had access to many different ones, from library archives to, say, the Smithsonian. And one of the earliest projects I did was in relationship to the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, and where 1,200 Filipinos were imported into the United States to perform in a kind of ad hoc village situation. It was essentially an ethnographic display, but was meant as a kind of educational look for Americans to see their new colony, the Philippines. So when I'm working with archives, inherently you come across a number of problematic images. And so as an artist, part of my challenge was, how do I process these images in a way that it doesn't just keep forwarding the same types of information? And one of the things I did was to physically block out the images with my hands as I was sitting in the archives. And so as I was rephotographing them, I'm in a sense protecting the folks that were put on display, and in a way, not disappearing them, but releasing them from having to kind of represent that field of vision. Subsequently, I was involved with the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian as an artist research fellow, and that was a wonderful time right before COVID. Thankfully, I got all my research in just before COVID hit. But this is what it looks like as an artist working within the archives. I spend my entire days there essentially calling forward files of folders, documents, and images, and shooting them in myriad ways. And it's a kind of systematic sifting through things, because as an artist, usually I don't exactly know what I'm looking for. If it's a direct kind of gaze, usually you wind up missing the kind of peripherals that become really interesting. So some of the works that resulted from this were literal artworks that kind of simulated the pileup or sifting of that kind of information. These are hand collaged photographs, so they're not a kind of digital display. They're actually layered on top of each other. And then as I'm also going through some of these ethnographic images, I realized that I wanted to release the subject from having to even be in them. And so digitally manipulating the images to let the indigenous folks go. It's not a removal, it's not a erasure or disappearance, it's a release. And so these also manifest in large-scale installations, sometimes big wall-based works as well as video components. And as I'm doing this work, I'm also amassing hundreds or even thousands of photographs of images that are not digitized and not available for public display. So one would have to get themselves physically into the archives to see these things. And as I'm photographing them, I'm creating what I call rogue finding aids, which are making visible to the public on access, if they request it from me, to see visually what's in these archives. And that saves the kind of hassle for someone to have to make that time and money commitment to go there. And I hope to carry forward these kinds of rogue archives, which I see as extra institutional. They don't rely on the institution to fund it or promote it or even spend the time or money to do this work. I also work with community archives, and last year I did a big project called Tender Sifter Keeper Center at the Frye Art Museum in Seattle. And this was with the Filipino-American National Historical Society. A very different archive because it's not a colonial one. It's an archive made by the community for the community, and the images are really different. And so instead of kind of covering over faces and people, I actually wanted to highlight it and bring folks together in community. And lastly, I'm going to finish up with, I'm really speeding through it. This is great, because I want our conversation. I'm going to follow up with a project that I started about 2 years ago, and it's still underway. I've been thinking about this term inherent vice, which is a conservation term that's related to archival degradation. So the tendency in physical objects to deteriorate because of the fundamental instability of the components of which they're made. So the yellowing of paper, the disappearance of photographs under adverse conditions or chemical effects. So this is something inherent in the medium itself, its own self-destruction. And so what I've been applying that to, I've been doing research in the Philippines, actually, in the Lopez Museum and Library, in a photojournalism morgue. It's the photo collection after photographs are printed for kind of old school newspaper production. They're physically filed away in what's called a photo morgue. And these photo morgues become a repository of historical events as well as images that have never ever been published but were taken by photojournalists. And so I've been focusing actually on US-backed martial law era time period in the Philippines. And so thinking beyond just the colonial era of the Philippines and American relationship into how the Philippines inherited an education system and a political system directly formed by the United States. So I see it as a kind of like parallel, not quite space. It devolved into martial law in 1972, and I think there's also cracks and flaws in that kind of method of democracy. But this newspaper, the Manila Chronicle, was shut down along with the entirety of the free press in 1972 in the Philippines. So it all stopped. But this photo archive still exists, and the entirety of it is not digitized. And so I've been physically going and kind of creating a visual survey of what's in these file folders, which are indexed by subject. That's sometimes quite subjective. So in this case, it's Anti-Riot Police Squad. And a lot of these images, again, have never been published. When they have been published, you can kind of see on the notations on the reverse side where it would get stamped with the date as well as the caption that accompanied it. So as I'm going through these images, though, I'm also trying to think of different ways to represent them to both an international and the Filipino public, because a lot of folks in the Philippines feel like they've seen these very stock or iconic images of authoritarian, the dictatorship that happened. But I'm trying to complicate that by also showing some of the images that were published in the same newspapers at the same time on lifestyle or design or kind of culture. Because there's something fascinating to me about collapsing everything together, and also how this might relate to how we view news images today in conjunction with a kind of like, I don't know, other cultural or pop events happening. I'm also trying to highlight, at the time, there was a robust movement of student leaders that were actively protesting right before the final crackdown into martial law. And as I'm looking at these, I'm also thinking about the slide that we're going through right now, the slide into a kind of authoritarian regime and what that looks like in other countries up until it's too late. So how this manifests in exhibitions, this is it opened up last year in Manila at Silver Lens Gallery, and the show is called Inherent Vice. And again, my challenge is to how do I present some of these like historical news images in a new way to the public, but also in a way that might shield or give people pause as to what they're actually looking at. So some of the images kind of confuse or push together references of both the protest and the martial law crackdown, as well as issues of like beauty and ornament and an almost kind of camouflaging of the politics of the day. This is a giant entry wall to the space. And lastly, or as a kind of bookend, I've also started researching at the Honolulu Star Bulletin photo archives. Again, another newspaper that shut down because after the Marcos dictatorship was expelled from the Philippines, the United States took them in and housed them and gave them sanctuary. So it was definitely a US-backed dictatorship. And I'm also showing the protests that happened alongside of it, as well as when we relook at some of these images and we look at the notations and the markings, there's this kind of metaphoric overlay on how things are framed and shaped and even positioned for the public. And I will wrap that up by saying, again, as I'm collecting all these things, I'm trying to figure out ways of how to keep pushing this information forward, especially since now that the Marcos government is basically back in power through their son in the Philippines, there's been a systematic erasure of martial law history, documents, and text. And again, I'd like to present this in the context of this not being just about the Philippines, but about a kind of metaphor of how other states, including our own, are kind of creating disappearances or a sort of like flattening of history in order to really feed and reshape what's to come. So bit.ly reader copies. Download, buy your own copy at very affordable prices of out-of-print texts on martial law, Philippine history, and culture. Many of these things are out of print or up to $300 on the open market, and you can get yours for, say, like $12 or $14, which is the cost of the print on demand. So with that, thank you very much.
So while we wait for this, I can say that my work is much less coherent than Stephanie's. In the sense that my working method is kind of random. I wander through cities or I wander through archives and I get curious about something. I ask questions about it, and if no one's asked that question and answered it, I kind of try to do that. And oftentimes I fail, but when I do, something happens and I publish it. So I've had a couple books come out in the last couple of years. Lauren talked about them, but I can say a little bit more about them. One is The Everyday Life of Memorials, which I started a couple decades ago as a set of curiosities, and it took me like 15 or 18 years to figure out what it was about. And I finally realized as I walked through cities and saw memorials, which at first repulsed me, and I ignored them, I started asking, well, why am I repulsed about them? And what are they doing to me and to everybody else? And memorials we usually think are commemorative objects or they're embroiled in political controversies, but I realized that most of the time they're doing neither one of those things. They're just there. There are places where birds land or places where people meet or people have lunch and things like that. So I was interested in the everyday life of memorials, and I was also interested in how they change states, how they move from being everyday objects to being, again, honored objects, commemorative or political. And so it was that movement that I was interested in, and as Lauren said, I brought together years of reading about memory and memory studies with an understanding of everyday environments and the vernacular. So, keep slashing, huh? So for instance, in Milan, there are just these, sorry, I'm supposed to be recorded, right? There are these people who are just sitting there, and their backs are to the memorial. The memorial has no function except as a seat back for them and as a major landmark to meet at. Or here in Munich, here are two examples. And I'm a little bit like Henri Cartier-Bresson, where I'm just sitting in the city lurking with my camera and waiting for something interesting to happen at a memorial. And there's this woman with her back to a memorial to the Bavarians who were defeated in Russia during Napoleon's Russian campaign. And she's just reading and having her lunch. And then right beside her is this father and son he's didactic. He's teaching his kid history. And so the two things are happening right side by side. Or on the right, this is an anti-fascist memorial from 1985. And I caught this woman just doing circles around it, complaining to her ex about something and smoking a cigarette. And this is on a through line in the city. So people were just passing it. And of course, there's a light on. It's an eternal flame. So we don't forget, but what are people doing? It's just part of the everyday. So even the things that are bold and even offensively bold in some cases are forgotten temporarily. And then this book came out in 2024. I don't know what's happening, but this is acting up. And this came out of a couple conference proceedings that I did with a former grad student of mine named Valentina Rosas Krause, and at the College Art Association, Society of Architectural Historians, and then we collected the papers together. Lauren Croyce actually contributed a piece to this. And this came out of this sticky problem that we have, that there are so few memorials and monuments to women. And we wanted to get to the bottom of it, but it also came out of the idea that the new ones that were coming out were deeply troubled. And we wanted to understand why and to have a kind of critical framework for understanding that. So this is on the cover is a controversial statue called Medusa with the Head of Perseus from 2022 in New York. And the art critic Jerry Salz, a New York art critic, wrote that she is an ooh-la-la monstrosity and condemned her shaved pudenda. He writes, she is dead optically, inert, intellectually barren. And you would never say this stuff again about a male statue. And this is troubling, and we wanted to shine a bright light on that. And so we tried to do that. This is just another example of these men ogling a statue at her unveiling, the Spigolatrice. So there are these problems of representation, problems of placement, problems of how we talk about it, and the book starts to get at that. And then as an extension of that, Valentina and I, and an undergrad actually at Berkeley, have started a website, which is supposed to be a crowdsourced website, so people will send in examples as they travel the world, because we can't go everywhere. And I hope that eventually this will be populated with short, pithy, critical essays about these monuments. And once it goes live, it will be really fun to see what happens. So when you put a call out to the world for say a call for papers for a conference, you can only get scholars. But when you put a call out to the world through a website, you can get any traveler doing this. So everybody who travels and sees a statue can show us a picture, and then they can do a little research, and then we'll edit it, and hopefully it will go up. And then new projects. So I said I'm disorganized in terms of how I actually stage my career, and it's so true. So one of the things I often do when I'm reading is I'll hear a word and it will feel like a word that's no longer used, or the way it's used is different. And so I'm interested in changing semantics or the changing rhetoric. And I've started through Hathitrust. Do you know Hathitrust? Raise your hand. So Hathitrust is this incredible tool where this organization has scanned millions and millions of books from libraries. And you can do keyword searches across books from the 17th century really on to the present. So you could look up the word specimen and then look up the word specimen in a book that has architecture in the title and figure out how architects are using the word specimen, or any of these words up here. And this has taken shape over years as a series or a bundle of keywords that get at issues of race and nation and style and architecture, the built environment, at that moment when the British were colonizing, when they're seeing themselves in comparative perspective and trying to make sense of themselves against the world. And so that's what this book is coming to be. They hated St. Basil's in Moscow because it was indistinct. It was not a specific specimen. It was impure. It was a mongrel. It was a chimera. These are all words that they used. It was a nondescript, which was one of the hardest things you could say about a building. Nondescript, of course, is just a biological term for like a rock sample or a fern that had not been described yet, so a species that was unknown. But then it becomes a term of disparagement. A nondescript becomes something that cannot be classified, and that creates anxiety. And so it's about the unclassifiable as people are learning about race and nation in the context of the built environment. And then a second project which I'm nervous to talk about, is called Men in the American House. And this comes out of actually teaching a course with Margaretta Lovell in American Studies. And I had been interested in the history of rooms and how we use rooms for a long time. And so I gave this lecture on the man cave. And I realized that almost all the literature on domesticity and domestic environments and houses in the United States, or anywhere really, is about women. That is to say, domesticity is coded feminine. And yet I kept seeing that men were carving out little spaces for themselves too. By the way, the work on domesticity is really good. I'm not disparaging it. But I was interested in the tension created by the fact that we think of the house as a domestic sphere largely controlled by women, but men have these little spheres within it. And so I started thinking about it, and there are these series of rooms that in fact are coded masculine. So the man cave is the most toxic, I guess you'd say. This is a Confederate man cave. So here I'm on blogs. I'm researching through blogs largely. And I don't have permission to use these images, but you won't tell on me, I hope. So the man cave is one. And then the den was actually a place within the house, which was a civilized sphere where the man could be partially wild. And he could, that is to say, be a bear or a lion. He could be partly uncivilized. And wow. And so this is conspiring against me, it seems like. So it has been degendered. The dens I grew up in were not masculine domains at all, but it started out as a masculine domain. And I'm interested in that journey, how that happened. I don't want to be the guy who studies men. So that's why, like, we really need to learn more about men. I don't want to be that guy. But I'm curious, and so I'm fighting against myself on this. And then there are a series of other masculine rooms. This is Elvis's den. And then there was something called a snuggery, which was a 19th century room that existed into the 20th century. Some of our presidents had them, actually, but this is Arthur Conan Doyle from Sherlock Holmes fame in his snuggery. And if you look at 19th century texts, especially by women, they say stuff like, while my husband was gone, I snuck into the snuggery and threw out all the broken bottles of whiskey and took all the ashes out and tore up all the furniture and threw it out and put on wallpaper. And like they're trying to civilize the man. They're trying to eradicate that room from the house. So that's where I'm now. I have a whole sabbatical for a year next year. I don't know which I'm going to do. I have 2 or 3 other book projects that I won't talk about, but I have to figure it out. Or I'll play video games all year, and that wouldn't be good. So thank you. Yeah.
Are these, oh, they're already on. Delightful. So organized. All right. I'm going to launch us into a conversation. And I thought that you two already knew each other because I see so many overlaps in your work. So I'm really excited to see it together and see overlaps that I didn't even think of. So the question that I was thinking about before coming today, I think we also saw manifested here. And it's that I see you both really as thinkers that are looking, okay, I'll just read it as I wrote it, influenced by the present, but also by archives, and never in a way that feels anachronistic. I don't feel like you're going to the past, looking for the way. It's not, you're not rereading the past in a way that I feel like is not historically informed, for example. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you find resonant archives or resonant paths and how you sort of pick out the moments. Stephanie, for you, for example, I was sort of thinking about turning from the colonial era to the 1970s and what that's doing for you, how you decide where to start. I think that archival piece is really important for both of you. And while you think about that, I'll just say that this is a question that was prompted in part by my planning for today. I Googled to try to find out if there were any rallies that were coming up. And then I learned about a whole bunch of other stuff that happened at Berkeley on April 10th. And I was somehow cheered to find out that in 1985, the UC Divestment Committee on the Campaign Against Apartheid started to mount these daily rallies. protesting the university's financial holdings in South Africa. But like alongside that moment, I also saw images of the 1950 protest meeting against the McCarthy era loyalty oath, which like feels even maybe more pressing and prominent now. So trying to think about ways that we can think about moments that are resonant in the present, how we find those moments, and sort of what the stakes of that are.
That's great. Yeah, no, I mean, what a great entry. I'll take it just a little bit based on the question you directed at me regarding the turn from colonial archives to archives from the 70s. And I think given that I've only been working with archives for the last 6 years, after about maybe 4 years, I felt like I'd seen so much of the colonial archive, because that's kind of what we have here in the United States. Like, you know, and it was just kind of like, okay, well, I'd like to see something different. And so going to the Philippines, which has a totally different record of itself, was also a nice way to extend it, because I think the conversation here in the U.S. can sometimes be so focused on the colonial archive to the point where it actually stops talking directly about 100 years later, which is today. And so trying to make that bridge, or else risk seeming kind of like stuck somehow in this past that actually isn't gone. It's just, mutated into a different set of problematics.
Yeah, I was struck after you spoke, Stephanie, about how you're an artist who goes into the archives, and I'm an architectural historian who's archivally based, who's been moving away from archives. Not because I'm against archives, but because I had 2 kids and it was really hard to get to them. And so I had to reimagine how to do architectural history with minimal use of the archives. And so luckily architecture exists both within the archives and more prominently in the world. And so I can just go out there and look at stuff and then ask questions that often require some archival research. But my work has become more conceptual as a result of that. Like I'll see something and I'll think, oh, that's weird. Why are there only men at this opening? And then I'll be reading about gender rather than going into the archive about that particular statue or something like that. So the archive, I have an ambivalent relationship to the archive now as a result of that. And then there's a lot of anti-archival fervor. Like a lot of my grad students have suspicion of archives because they think that they're hegemonic institutions. And so I think to insist on archives is probably not what I want to do, but I think that there's still a lot that can be done with them. So yeah, that's my ambivalence right now.
I think you're both too like building new archives too. Like I'm thinking of the project that you're doing on photographing women and sculptures of women. Like is there, and thinking about ways that archives might not just be like the photographs you showed, Stephanie, of like really dusty boxes in these institutional spaces that are always either like too hot or too cold, or so thinking about ways that you're reprinting these books that are out of print, and thinking too then about ways that these might be archives that are for academics, but are also for all kinds of different people. Whether you think about that as a part of your work in or against archives, or whether you think of it as something that's totally different.
You know, I'm just beginning to think through the website conceptually. And at first I thought of it as a way of making accessible a lot of the world. So that's one of the tricks of the web. You can shrink the world and give access to some part of it, or some entry point into the world can happen through a website. And so I'm interested in the ability to put things side by side that couldn't be side by side in the world. And I'm interested in giving access to people, to cities, to municipalities who want to build statues, to people who want to think through the problems of representing women in public space, whether it's as a memorial or a public sculpture. Sometimes there's a blurry space between them. Giving people access to lots and lots of images of them so that they don't make bad decisions. Or if they make bad decisions, they at least have a justification for it. And they have lots of examples at hand. So it is an archive in a certain sense. Archives are made of that kind of thing. It will be a partially original archive because I hope we're harvesting original photos from people that they'll exist everywhere because the digital stuff can go everywhere. But the aggregation will be a one-of-a-kind thing, I hope. I don't know, yeah.
Yeah, I think to address also the problematics of the archive. So when I first started working with, say, the Smithsonian or I don't know, just different formal collections, it was problematic because it obviously had a very distinct curatorial vision of what was inside of it, and it was mostly through the kind of gaze of empire. And so that, I remember just feeling very critical of that. And the irony today, though, right, is there's this kind of like massive kind of deletion of things within archive and information. So these spaces in which I felt I was even critiquing them by being in them, now I'm actually tasked weirdly with defending them. Because interestingly, they also provided, you know, nuggets of things that hadn't quite surfaced yet. And so that's one interesting thing happening today. And then also the other is that the shifting then to focusing on community archives where, you know, images are made by the people for the people, as well as the unknown archives like the photo morgues that all sit there and everyone has no idea what's inside or even why it's important. Like, you know, it's very different from like the national story, I think. And so for me, that's why I think I keep going back to it in different ways.
You know, I appreciate I'm reading between the lines that you encounter the archive with a sense of wonder, and the sense of wonder that I certainly have had many times when I go into an archive. And then I find that enchantment sometimes can bewitch me, and I stop being critical occasionally. Because I'm finding so much stuff, you can be overwhelmed by everything you find. And I wonder if you ever feel that way. If faced, because archives can be so massive, you cannot countenance them all. You can't put your arms around them exactly. And I wonder if you ever find yourself just jaw-dropped, unable to think in an archive.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I called up a couple slides where you could kind of see in the back, like folders and folders and folders and folders of, you know, of photos, and literally imagine like shelves and shelves and shelves of those completely untouched. And so everything you open up, you're like, oh my God, that's a great thing. Like that could be an exhibition, or, you know, or some kind of like resuscitation of whatever is in there or what can be reconfigured from within that. So yeah, it's massive.
Yeah.
I hope that you are all amazed that these two academics and I stayed relatively on time, so we have time for your questions. Does anybody want to ask a question? I have a lot more, too, if you don't. Oh, I think we're supposed to give you a mic. And by we, I mean Laurie.
Hi, everybody. I'm Gigi. I'm curious what you all kind of think about, like, the problematics of nostalgia when dealing with archives or history. For me, like, the immediate answer, obviously, it could lead to very kind of, I'm thinking about MAGA, I'm thinking about Israel, I'm thinking about just the ways that sometimes people can use historical ideas, narratives, what have you, to kind of justify like you know, horrific colonial projects, or yeah.
Lauren and I taught Svetlana Boym's The Future of Nostalgia, and in fact, I just taught it yesterday, and at least one of my students is here. But I don't have a good answer to your question exactly, except to say that maybe you should read Boym. And she's sophisticated, nuanced, and she I think gets underneath the trouble of nostalgia and historicizes it. So the nostalgia we might feel, like Make America Great Again, that hazy, weird past that they're referring to, that's different than the nostalgia that might have been felt in the 1970s or in the 19th century, or in the 17th century when it was born as a word, as a, you know, as a kind of homesickness for a thing that didn't exist or a place that no longer existed, a slight fantasy. Yeah.
What's the name of it?
Oh, Boym, B-O-Y-M, The Future of Nostalgia.
I think too, in terms of thinking about the creation of so-called origin stories, you know, through the archive, like I've encountered, say, the same press photo, but with two different captions pasted behind it because it was utilized to tell a different story. And so if we can think of maybe the other content within archives about how each one can be kind of positioned or manipulated or represented in order to push a certain ideology or propaganda, that same image can also, I'm proposing, be used in to reject that that narrative as well. It's just depending. It's like strategically trying to kind of like reverse it somehow, and that's for me been an interesting challenge.
The etymology of nostalgia, people talk about it a lot, but the second part of the algia is like analgesic. It has to do with pain. And so I think we have to have the pain come back. It can't be nostalgia. It has to be nostalgia. So I think keeping the pain in mind, which people don't want to have. So MAGA doesn't talk about the bad stuff of the past, right? And I think we have to prick it a little bit, hurt them. That's not a prescription.
Other questions?
Hi, I'm Wendy. Like talking about archives and just myself like thinking about it, I wonder in both of your guys' process working with archives, have you guys ever had a moment where you were sort of like afraid to work with archives? Because I feel like we tend to hold a lot of value to them. They're almost like treasures in a sense, and so it's like, oh, don't touch them, they're like untouchable, or you shouldn't really mess with them because they're like of the past. So I'm wondering, like, has it ever been like worrying for you or like scary for you to like work with these type of archives?
That's a good question too, right? Yeah. Do you want to start with that?
Well, I was at the Smithsonian on a pre-doctoral fellowship, and some toxic materials fell out of a folder. So I've literally been intoxicated by
physically
them.
toxic.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So because they had an asbestos collection, and asbestos dust is carcinogenic. But that's literalizing your question. I've never had fear that I will unearth something that will frighten me, because that's what I'm after. I want to actually frighten people.
But Wendy's question is more like you might damage the things.
Oh.
Like the things are somehow.
Oh, is that the question?
Or not do it justice.
Yeah,
maybe.
I've totally damaged things. Yeah, I've brought completely. There are things that are old especially during World War II. There was the paper wasn't good, and it was like pressed oatmeal almost, and you'd take it and it would crumble. And
Inherent vice.
Yeah, and exactly. And I'd look at the curator or archivist and I'd say, what do I do? And they'd come and remediate whatever needed to be done. It's part of the game that, you know more about that than I do because you're interested in it.
Well, as an interesting aside, so when I was at the Smithsonian for my own research fellowship, they were in the archive room. I would be there with lots of other researchers. So they're, looking at lots of documents throughout American history. And at the end of the day, the carpeted floor would be covered in little tiny bits of history that had like fragmented and fallen off those documents. It was amazing. You'd look down there, and then they would vacuum them up. And at a certain point towards the end, I was like, oh my God. And I was like, can you not vacuum up? And I will go on my hands and knees and pick up all the little bits of history and collect them, because they had fragmented from so many different documents and things. And I was like, I'm gonna do something with this. So I have all these like precious, weird little fragments that have come out. Again, that's the physical decay of some of the things. The other problem I can think of is that, so with the Lopez Museum and Archive, they're essentially documenting images of right before martial law and authoritarianism took place. It's still a fairly dangerous time in the Philippines in terms of holding that knowledge. My fear was that if I showed it, it would be placed on the radar and then be physically taken. That's totally possible. Also, given the fact that the entirety has not been digitized. And so I had to balance out, and I talked it through with the archivists, and we sort of, created an understanding of how to show politically sensitive material that might out the fact that they exist. But we decided that it's actually better for the public to see these images because many of the young people had never seen images of right before martial law, shut everything down. So I don't know, it's a parallel, it's a response to your question.
Hi. Building off the pain and the fear, I feel like most people's work to some level is about how to like twinge heartstrings in your own specific way. And I'd imagine that's a very different process for the two of you. For the active memorials, there's, the loss heartstring, and then there's also all the pain of colonialism and all that. But I was just wondering how you both navigate representing the heartstring twinge motivation that you felt inside of yourself to the public.
That's an interesting question. I actually am not very emotional about my work, and I'm not sure if maybe that's what you were asking, or I'm pretty clinical, actually. I mean, I feel very passionate about getting and working with these images and putting them out there, but I don't. I'm not sure if I understand. I think emotional manipulation can be utilized in different ways, and I hope that my work doesn't do that, but I'm not. I don't know.
Occasionally I come up to something or encounter something that I think could create trouble for people, for me. For instance, at the Berlin Holocaust Memorial, it's actually the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. That's what its title is. So it's pretty heavy and straightforward in how they call it. And it became a site where gay men photographed themselves for Grindr, and then they'd meet there sometimes. So it became a rendezvous site. There's a layer of eroticism, of homoerotic eroticism. That's redundant, but you get what I'm saying. And I think it's a really important part of the story, and people have written about it. I don't really write about it as a problematic issue. I'm interested in plumbing the issue of what it means to have these one of the most potentially sacred sites in Europe be used for all sorts of other things, and what that means. And I'm interested in the hullabaloo around it. I actually don't have moral problems with people using the site in any way, as long as they don't destroy it, I guess. As long as it's open for others to use afterwards, it's fine with me. But when I put that image up of men in almost complete undress in front of this heavy memorial, I feel people in the crowd or in the audience. I don't get crowds, I get audience. I feel them have a pause. I feel the emotional thing that maybe you're talking about, and I'm wary of it. I'm nervous that I'm doing what Stephanie just said, manipulating in some way. And so oftentimes I'll put it up for a second and then put a different image up, because I don't want to do too much work through that image necessarily, because it's too striking almost. And then the other images, we get doled to them as a result of that. An ordinary memorial won't look interesting, and people go daydreaming for the rest of the lecture. So I do have worries about the power that some images have, especially in real time when you're talking.
All right, we're out of time. It's 1 o'clock. And I want to respect you, get you back to whatever you're doing. Thank you so much for coming. Beth, do you want to say? You look like you were. Okay, you're just so excited. Okay.